bum 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 bum.
You're listening to Tove, a podcast about the good place and Jewish ideas. Hi, I'm John Spiro-Savet, and I'm so excited to be here co-hosting with Myra Meskin and Ben Gurin. And if the two of you would like to say a little bit about where you do your Jewish teaching and learning.
Sure. I'm a PhD student in the graduate program of religion at Boston University.
And I work remotely from Boston for the American Jewish University as the Associate Director for the Mass Center for Jewish Journeys.
And you are both rabbis.
Both rabbis of different denominations. I was ordained at Ziegler, which is a conservative seminary, and Ben was ordained at HUC. But we met in LA because both campuses are in LA.
And the two of you are married to each other.
Yes.
Come to that in a minute.
I checked this morning. Yes, we are still married.
Now, when we have new co-hosts, the thing I like to ask is which of the main characters of The Good Place do you think you are most like? And I want to say none of this, what rabbis always do, which is that there's some of everybody, some of all of them, and each of us. I'm going to force you. This isn't a life commitment. This is just a conversation starter.
I know you've been getting a lot of rabbinic cheaties. I think I'm going to add to your tally there of definitely cheaties indecisiveness and yet excited about the big questions. I'm trying to think, what other cheaty qualities do I have? Am I saying the right thing?
Wanting to be, I think you want to contribute something. Like Chidi's very excited about his thesis and wants to contribute something good, but also doesn't.
Oh no, what do I do? Yeah. I've been getting many stomach aches.
And Myra?
I was thinking about this last night. I think I was identifying a lot with Janet lately, at least in the sense of the role that Janet plays for her group of friends, which is, I think Janet's best quality as a friend is her listening, that she's easy to confide in and you can tell her anything. And I that's what I strive to do. And I think I do that. I also think, she's very intelligent, but a little bit naive at sometimes, and knows the pop culture things, but is a little bit awkward. And I think I sometimes fit that bill.
I have to go back. You might be the first Janet. Actual Janet, as opposed to I said I was an aspiring Janet. So I'll ask you that other question too, which is which.
I don't know if I identify as a walking, dictionary or information delivery system or anything like that. But.
Is there, which of the characters would you wish to be more like?
I think I said I was thinking about Michael in the sense of both his willingness to try new things, to sort of take a risk, which I think is really, really bold. And also just I think he often achieves the level of radical amazement that I think I would strive for, of just he's just so curious and interested in the world, and finds fascination in the smallest things like paper clips and suspenders and car keys and things like that.
So much done with belts.
Yeah.
I think I could also do the cop out of I see positive things in all of them that I would love.
Of course,
but I'm going to try to go with something eclectic. I'm going to pick Jason. Jason's joie de vivre, and what else? I said that right in French, right? My mother-in-law is French. I'm a little bit worried if I mispronounce French on this thing. He cares about his friends. He's very loving, but he's also, he knows what fulfills him. He loves being in relationship with other people. He doesn't have a lot of cheaties anxiety. He just kind of acts, and he knows what makes a fulfilling life, which is being with your friends and jalapeno poppers. So I would love that.
There's something about jalapeno poppers, or I don't know, and is it jalapeno poppers, that has popped up in a couple of different comedy contexts, and I wonder if that's a thing, but side issue. Anyway, so I would normally ask you about your Good Place origin stories, but I understand you have quite a profound story, which is that your daughter, who I just met before we went on our Zoom, is called Eleanor.
Yes, we did.
Tell
Tell us
the story. I will say that
honestly, like total origin story, we can't totally remember. We did not watch it in time. We binge watched the first 2 seasons just before the start of the 3rd season. And
this question required a lot of conversation. We were scrolling through text messages of, did you tell me about the show? Did I tell you about the show? And
I think we decided, we had seen the billboards for it, and I was like, oh, one of those shows about the afterlife, and wasn't that excited about it. But we were on a Mike Schur kick. We love Parks and Rec. We had just like finished rewatching The Office, and I think Ben was like, oh, well, Mike Schur has another show that just started. Maybe we should give it a shot. And then we fell in love.
Yeah.
Wait, you were married at the time or dating?
We were already married.
Yeah, that was our first year of marriage. We'd just gotten back from.
Yeah, our first year of marriage was my rabbinic year in Israel. We had just gotten back and we started binge watching. So yeah, and then we loved the show, and we were naming our daughter, and I've been looking through name books, and we had 2 of the people we wanted to, we were considering naming her after was Ben's great grandmother Helen and my grandmother Eileen, and we looked up Helen in a name book, and it said, oh, Helen is like a name with the same meanings as Eileen and Eleanor. And we were like, wow, that seems really fitting. And we did fall in love with Eleanor a little bit because of The Good Place.
Yeah.
And we actually pulled up what we said to her at her Brit ceremony, where we actually admitted that we somewhat named our daughter after a TV show.
I think I read it when we did the baby naming.
Did read it. Yeah.
So here's what we said about her at her baby naming. This was after we said very nice things about our grandparents. Cards on the table, you are also more than a little named after Eleanor Shellstrop from the TV show The Good Place. Eleanor grows into becoming a person with the unique combination of traits that your mama and I share and love about each other. Seriousness of purpose mixed with silliness. Eleanor Shellstrop doesn't shy away from tackling the toughest problems, for example, saving humanity, while maintaining a playful attitude with a bit of irreverence. We hope you learn from her example the power of tshuva, answering the call to leadership, and advocating for your friends. Those are our Eleanorish blessings for her.
Wow. First, just wow. And I wonder if there are other Eleanor babies
I have
around.
No doubt. It's on the up. Eleanor as a name. I think when we were looking at names, Ben kept searching the Social Security website has like a name popularity thing where it tells you like how many kids are named that name recently. And Eleanor was down and is on its way back up. So I would credit The Good Place.
Yeah,
for sure.
It is interesting. My sister is named Ellen, and she's named after our grandmother, Eleanor, who died in between when the 2 of us were born. And I just always thought of it as an older generation's name.
Well, you're talking to a Myra.
Yeah.
So, the other Myras I've heard of are, my grandmother's name is Myra. So.
I know that Max is coming back and things. But,
it was at the pediatrician's office or something that somebody they were like, oh, what's her name? And I said, Eleanor. And she goes, you don't hear that much anymore, do you? And I was like, well, it's a classic. It's coming back.
We were talking before that we both listened to the official Good Place podcast that Ted Danson always says Eleanor.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Very prominent. I was also noticing very prominently in this episode because the name Eleanor is said so many times because they're talking about real Eleanor and fake Eleanor. And
it's making me a little self-conscious about how I refer to her and names that I just take for granted that I say that maybe I'm not saying them the right way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it seems like up until the podcast, Ted Danson was like not aware of the fact that like that's how he was saying it. There's like a moment in the podcast where it's like, do I really say that?
Yeah.
And we're like, yeah. It's pretty prominent. We still like the name.
Well, we are here to talk about Chapter 9, which is called Someone Like Me as a Member, and would love to hear you start us off with a summary of the episode.
Eleanor and real Eleanor died in the same place at the same time. Real Eleanor, in fact, was trying to save Eleanor's life. Tahani tries to help Michael be a tougher negotiator with Trevor and the other representatives from the bad place so he can save Eleanor. And bad Janet makes her first appearance. Trevor, Chidi, Eleanor, and real Eleanor go on a double date, and Eleanor is demoralized by both real Eleanor's life story and Chidi's obvious regard for her. Janet and Jason discuss jalapeno poppers and begin to bond. Eleanor flashes back to times when she avoided being part of a group in high school, with friends and at work. And finally, she says that she has changed because of the people who want to help her.
Thank you. So, do you have any just particular favorite parts of this episode?
Pulling up our list here. We were watching it last night, and I don't think I'd laughed out loud at watching the show for a while until, putting a critical eye on it. You commented that, wow, you really notice how smart the show is when you're like really
Yeah, I think I laughed out loud of like when real Eleanor is describing her life story, and she keeps going yada yada yada, and I went to America, yada yada yada. I learned English from Seinfeld, yada yada yada. I feel like the delayed aspect of that joke, I just thought was like really funny and well. I think we also love we're big Parks and Rec fans, so watching Adam Scott, who plays Ben Wyatt on Parks and Rec, who is like the nicest. But Ben Wyatt, who he played on Parks and Rec, is like the nicest guy who like wouldn't hurt a soul and like is like very anxious about hurting anyone's feelings or doing the wrong thing. And he's now playing Trevor, who is like just the worst of the demons.
Those were also our last two Purim costumes, I think. Leslie and Ben.
That's true.
We
yeah.
went as Leslie and Ben, and then we went to Judy and Eleanor.
We did.
Yeah.
We'll get you a picture.
Yeah.
You definitely have to put that on the website.
Yeah.
He has lots of like little moments I didn't even notice before until we were watching the episode with a like critical eye of just like looking bored or like making weird like sighing sounds or like farting noises or other things in the middle of people's conversations.
Letting people all of it now.
Oh, that was, I didn't even notice that before. It just like eats and like food just like falls out of his mouth.
That was the part you told me to rewind of like, did he just do that? That was a good choice. Ted Danson's reads of lines are probably my favorite. So every once in a while, I just kind of think in my head, a unicorn bib.
Yeah, he's got this great and the physical comedy in describing the I'm moving my hands now, the unicorn holders.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
The
corn holders. Yeah.
Right.
Unicorn corn holders. Yeah. Yeah.
If somebody hasn't made those on Etsy, I don't know.
There you go. I'm sure they exist.
Yeah.
Obviously, Bad Janet, who makes that one brief appearance. That is
so good.
Lots of first appearances of things are mentioned. First mention of Sean.
Yeah.
Yeah. Bad Janet, the demons. You get definitely a lot more hint of what the bad place is going to be like. The fact that they're always texting, and the Bluetooth guy kills me. He's my favorite.
The bit where they unwind by listening to should we listen to Mussolini's speech or the rant or Nixon ragging on the Jews? That was.
I was gonna say, was that the first mention of Jews on the show? Do we need to comment on that? I think I paused it last night and said, do we need to bring that up or no?
I think it's a little edgy because I think is Mike Schur himself actually Jewish?
I'm sure his writers are Jewish. Yeah. I know Megan Amram on the podcast, right? So like when she comes on the official Good Place podcast, one of the writers, and like she says her name and something, she's like, someone asked like, oh, Amram, where does that come from? She's like, Amram from the Bible.
The show, is consistently not religious, and I thought it was kind of interesting actually that they threw that. I mean, because all this stuff about the Jews is as a trope in whatever media or stuff like that is it's kind of a topical thing, and the show doesn't really talk directly about issues of the day at all. So it was kind of between Mel Gibson and Mussolini and Nixon. That's a pretty Jewy trifecta there.
Yeah. I don't know if Mike Schur is Jewish, but I would say he's definitely a mensch in the sense of like the way people talk about him and just like the kind of comedy that he enjoys and the kind of shows he produces. They're optimistic, believing in the goodness of people and the ability of human beings to rise to their best selves. And so I think that's why we love Mike Schur shows.
The importance of service.
Yeah.
Being part of a team. Yeah.
So I really like the Atiya Sarkar who plays, who's called here Real Eleanor. And we said we're definitely, spoilers are totally on. It's even more, just what you're saying about Adam Scott, like she's playing this role so earnestly when we know even her character is going to turn into this complete opposite.
So she doesn't know at the time, right? That's what we were listening.
We listened to the podcast.
The Good Place podcast, and she at the time said she didn't know the end of season 1 twist. At the time that she was playing this, she was just playing it as the best person ever, which would be like the person who even is just fully compassionate and fully she thinks Eleanor is in love with Chidi or something like that, and she just wants to be supportive of her, you
Right.
know, or like she apologizes for not actually saving her life even
Yeah.
though she tried, like
Right.
I am so sorry about that, like really earnestly, you know.
It is so hard to play, and I think so hard to write. Also, I mean, like you know, what you wrote about Eleanor, who's a much, you know, our Eleanor, who is a much more character of many facets,
Yeah.
is probably easier to play and easier to create, and to embody this person without being so like we can't possibly like this character. Like
Uh-huh.
that's I think a really hard thing to pull off, and just
Yeah.
and how straight she plays this whole thing. What was the line? Can I have some water and whatever food that doesn't turn you out
Doesn't
that
turn
doesn't
to
turn to spiders in your mouth? Or she describes being, you know, left in it. Was it like a fish tank or something abandoned?
Right,
Yeah,
right.
in
You know,
Bangladesh.
she just looks straight, and it's and they're perfect. I think I've often commented about this show how they're how far to push a joke in a bit. You know,
Mhm.
they push it just one step beyond where you might laugh and then laugh one more time, and
Yeah.
then they pull back. And in that mode, actually, I loved when that interaction between Janet and Jason,
Mhm.
their first little moment of their budding
Mhm.
romance, where Jason gives her a hug and she asks why, and he explains, "You're the first person who's ever been nice to me," and then she says, "Okay," and then she stands up again. It's like
Right.
so solid.
Yeah, Janet's like process of becoming human in relationship to Jason. I think I don't know. I think we definitely noticed that a lot more this watch through. The fact that she just says okay afterwards, which like in later seasons, Janet wouldn't say that. She
Right.
would interact back, but you can tell she's like really trying to process someone being kind to her and not just asking her for things.
Which she does do. She does do that later when other people come to her or whatever. She like will throw her arms around them in a hug, but like
Uh-huh.
not really get it or not really. I mean, this is the moment that like really seeds their relationship for the rest of the series.
Oh, I know this one.
So
And
Jason's
excited.
response of when she's like, people keep asking me questions and I don't know the answer to them. And he goes, oh, that was my whole dang life on Earth.
Yeah.
and on the other side, there's the moment earlier in the when the bad place people are around and she's not able to, I guess, answer. I forget what the question was. She wasn't able to answer, and they
I
kind
think
of,
he wants jalapeno
Yeah,
peppers.
poppers. Yeah.
Poppers, right?
oh
He
right,
wants
and she
jalapeno
doesn't.
poppers, and she's like, "Sure, no problem. But tell me, like, what is a jalapeno? And
Also,
what
what
is
is
a
a poppers?
also what is a jalapeno poppers?"
And then they mock her, you know, they laugh at her for
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
knowing or for being, you know, not quite fully uploaded, and she kind of laughs with them, and I was so horrified, like I felt so
Mhm.
that was so icky, and
Yeah.
Yeah.
the story about how, you know, essentially how she and Michael become more human, I guess, over the show
Yeah.
is sort of in a way what you're saying, at least as compelling as watching the humans
Mhm.
become more fully
Oh
whatever.
yeah.
So, you know,
Very.
for me, these episodes, like the last one and this one, were kind of in this series of that I kind of had to get to them. I felt like there was a handful of episodes, maybe five, six, seven, that were kind of turn out to be meteor, and then there's this kind of story work that has to get done before. I think this is where probably around the time in my first watch I kind of actually dropped off, and now, you know, I'm trying
Yep.
to
Yeah.
power back through, and knowing how much I love what's happening, what's going to come in season two and beyond, and knowing that this is like wondering how this is necessary to build to there has been kind of how I've entered into it. And this particular episode actually got me thinking about something that I haven't talked about at all with any of the other hosts, which is just the Hebrew word good, tov, which is what I've named the podcast, and how the Torah actually first describes the things that are described as good are in the first chapter of creation, pretty much everything. And it's not until the second chapter that we ever hear of something that's not good. First, we hear about the tree of
Yeah.
knowledge of good and bad, so that we forget our first thing that's bad. And then right after that being introduced, where God says it's not good for the man or this human, first human number one, to be alone.
Mhm.
And I thought that was really interesting as a what not good essentially being defined as being isolated or being alone, which is obviously the topic and the title even of this episode. And I was thinking about how it wasn't until I don't think this came to me until until very, very recently, the recent time teaching about this Garden of Eden story, that like there's everything about Eve in particular trying to decide how to process this ethical decision that she has to make seems like it's very thoughtful, and she thinks about her what she likes about the fruit and how it's interesting and all these kinds of things. But the only thing that like she's just alone in that moment. She makes that alone, and and then what happens afterwards between Adam and Eve is just all about alone, and that goodness can't really come alone. And I think one of the things that and I will end my speech shortly about the one of the things I think that maybe I want to say that Torah or Judaism brings that sometimes classical ethical philosophy doesn't bring, and what I like about the show that it does bring is that your individual goodness is actually a team effort, and you actually can't. There's no such thing as being good on your own or developing your good qualities on your own.
Yeah. I think for me, the crux of the episode and why I remembered this episode, or the moment in this episode that stands out to me, is the moment at their double date, Trevor and Eleanor with real Eleanor and Chidi, and hearing about the different circumstances of the two Eleanors' lives. Our Eleanor, our protagonist, says like that she went through this trauma of her parents' divorce, and we see later on just how troublesome her parents are as role models in general. But she goes through this divorce and of her parents, and that really affects how she acts in life. And then we sort of hear the incredible sob-worthy story of real Eleanor of like, oh, I never met my birth parents. I was left in a fish tank in Bangladesh. I was adopted by the Shellstrops. They died when I was 4. All of these things that she survived, and yet she somehow comes out as this saint of a person. And sort of thinking about like what are the circumstances that shape how someone is able to either rise above it or let their circumstances overcome them. Like what is it that does that, and how much of it is reliant on the people surrounding you. In that flashback where Eleanor is in high school and makes an announcement that she doesn't want to be friends with anybody, she doesn't want to belong to any group or have any people surrounding her. There was a question where I paused and I asked Ben, would she have turned out any better if she had, joined that mean girl group or joined the stoner group or like whatever, do you just need to have friends, or do you need to have the right friends in order to be able to sort of overcome and to have good influences and to rise above whatever, or to have the strength to sort of rise above whatever life throws at you?
You pointed out later with the movie theater thing that like her 2 friends, her roommate also viewed Eleanor as a bad influence. Like, I think I should move out and find a different roommate. Of that is some of her aloneness also is it self-perpetuating in that capacity of she wants to be alone. She doesn't want to be part of other groups. And then people who are in groups look at her and say, wow, that has caused you to be the kind of person that I don't want to be around either.
The episode did a really nice job of giving us enough laughs really toward the top. We didn't get really like the meat of those flashbacks. I thought we did have the high school one kind of early on, but most of the stuff that really articulated, I think, the difference between kind of a real transactional approach to people and this emptiness of not having somebody came later on. And I felt like they really nailed it. I mean, she really, she talks about the way where she gets fired for not wanting to be part of a team. She's like, severance, that's great. And and not sitting next to people is worth it because she gets more popcorn with her own points. And I thought that was really nicely. I mean, it's kind of, I think, an obvious point, but I thought they delivered it really kind of nicely.
She really seems irked by the distinction of being called fake Eleanor versus real Eleanor, and why does that bother her? So, I mean, I'm sure it would bother any of us to a certain extent, but the idea that like fitting in or sort of belonging is, like she wants to be identified as herself and not about like, does she fit, right? Like fitting is not what she wants to do, and she doesn't want to be identified as, fitting or not fitting. She just wants to be herself.
And that she, I'm thinking as you're saying that in Maimonides, when he talks about the various things a person can do to do tshuva, one of them is to change your name.
Yeah.
And here she's, she's going to be, you would think she's going to be dogged forever by the fact that there's someone with her exact name who she, can't live up to. And this whole thing we've constantly go back to about the Reb Zusia, and
Yes.
Right.
I wanted you just to be the best, and here she's faced with someone who has her and
Her
who
exact name, and is that, why weren't you like Eleanor Shellstrop? Well, I met a real Eleanor Shellstrop who's like way better than me. Yeah, I think that makes sense of why it's working here.
So Myra, your question about that role of actual friendship versus connection is really, I think, super too, because it seems like, and our other hosts have pointed this out along the way, that as much as Chidi has been her actual teacher of philosophy, which was done for transactional purposes to earn her enough points to stay where she is, that her first it's her, she doesn't, I think she doesn't want to sell him out, and make him, she comes to something where she feels like she has to confess to do something for him. And here in this episode, she acknowledges that like she wants to be like him, and that's her choice. She's been inspired, and it's really unfolded over time. That's the other thing I think that sometimes I look for in philosophy that doesn't happen, is the sense that you just, as good as we want to be, we can't necessarily be that good today, and it's frustrating. Like, and I guess that means the person we're with can't be as good today as they're eventually going to be, and how to have the appropriate amount of patience and maybe the appropriate amount of pushing to get there. And how many times that both Michael and Chidi have to, and even real Eleanor, say like, we want you to be part of our group, and she pushes that off. And I couldn't even pinpoint in this episode where is the light bulb. Is it just that it's that combination, I guess, of that accumulation and then her final flashback? It's like, oh, I get it.
Wanting that sense of belonging, right? Her first team fell apart on her, right? Her first team, her family, just disintegrated, and she was on her own from a very early age. We learned that later in the series, just how disturbing her family life was. But sort of, it really does take time and patience to become that person. And I think when Ben and I were naming our daughter, we were like, you definitely shouldn't name your kid after a TV show character unless you've seen the whole thing. Right, you want to be able to see their full arc,
Right?
Because it really does take her time. If people have only seen the first season, or individual episodes, you're like, why would you want to name your kid after someone who is, sort of like, she is kind of insulting, and she is kind of brash, and not always her best self, and it takes her time to really feel like even wanting to become better, for the real reason. Right. And I think she refers to that later on too, of like noting that in the beginning, she just wanted to be good or act good so that she could stay. And then I think this is sort of her sort of actually stepping out and saying, no, I want to be good because of my teacher and because of my friend, and that they inspire me, and I want to be with them and exist alongside them and be worthy of their company.
I hadn't thought about this until you mentioned that her first team fell apart on her, but that her loneliness was really a defense mechanism of she had to strike out on her own. Trusting other people can only, hurt you. And where the ethics of The Good Place, the show, ends up of, man, sometimes circumstances on earth make it rather difficult to be a good person in relationship to others. And what would it look like if you removed some of those hardships and some of that hurt? Could people improve beyond their station? And so some of her experience here is unlearning defense mechanisms that actually served her well on Earth, right? She was able to survive on her own from the age of 16.
When we think about the bigger post-twist idea of the show, like, she is having this awakening despite the fact that the people around her aren't the most phenomenal people in the universe, and actually some of them are conspiring against her.
Right.
Which is pretty remarkable. So you brought something too, I think, some Jewish texts or ideas to put on the table here.
I thought of this Agadata, the story from the Talmud. This is kind of the story I think about when I'm thinking of The Good Place as a show, Begadol, or writ large here. Yeah, Myra and I were learning it together, and I think it has a lot of interesting parallels with this episode. The idea of wanting to belong and wanting your place in the good place revolve around a student-teacher relationship. So I'll do a quick summary here. But you guys, let's learn this together. Chime in if you're like, oh, that's interesting. That's like, the drill. So we're in the Babylonian Talmud. The tractate is Chagiga, and it's the bottom of 15a to 15b. One of the most famous images in rabbinic literature is Rebbe Meir following his teacher, Elisha ben Abuya, who here is called Acher, the other, after his apostasy. Acher has left the rabbinic fold, but Rebbe Meir is still in relationship with him. And Elisha ben Abuya is riding his horse on Shabbat, which is a major no-no, and Rebbe Meir is following along after him, learning Torah from him. They get to the boundary of as far as you can go on Shabbat, and Acher says, Meir, you should turn around because I know from the steps of my horse that this is as far as you can go on Shabbat. So I know I'm breaking Shabbat, but you shouldn't be, or you don't. I know that you don't want to be. And Rebbe Meir does a little play on words here where he says, I can go back, but you too can also go back, and making a play on tshuva as return here. And Acher says a really interesting statement. He says, haven't I already told you, I have already heard from behind the veil, behind the separation, some kind of prophecy in some regard.
Between the two worlds.
Between the two worlds, yeah, that return rebellious children, chutz me'acher. Everybody can do tshuva except for Acher. And how he knows this isn't really gone into. But I thought when we were thinking about this episode of what Acher's saying here is saying, I don't belong here. That was the thing that Eleanor said 2 episodes back of
when she reveals herself as I'm here by mistake.
Yeah, I don't belong in the good place. And Acher's very much got this built up belief called I don't belong there. Rebbe Meir isn't buying it. So he takes him to either a series of study halls or synagogues, depending on which of these paragraphs you're looking at. And there is a thing in rabbinic literature of a particular form of divination that you would go and see a child learning and say, hey, what are you reading? And whatever verse they tell you in the Tanakh and the Hebrew Bible, that verse, it's like reading your horoscope in the morning. That verse would tell you something about what's going on. And so Rebbe Meir and Acher go to 13 different synagogues, and they walk in, they ask a kid, hey, what are you reading? And it's all lines in the Tanakh saying, basically proving Acher right that you can't return. One of them is in Isaiah 48:22. There is no peace, said the Lord, concerning the wicked. He's just going one after another, and they're all verses about Acher saying, see, I told you, God said I can't, everyone else can do tshuva, but I can't. I don't belong in the good place.
Well, I think that what's coming in terms of that relationship between Rebbe Meir and Acher as his teacher, in the good place, it's flipped a little bit. Who is teacher and who is student? And
you pointed out that like it's cheaty, really. Like she doesn't want to be a part of a group or stay or feel like she belongs until she's like sees Chidi as an. I guess now I'm thinking of Chidi as an example versus fake Eleanor or real Eleanor as an example. That like Eleanor can look at real Eleanor and say, oh my gosh, I can never be like that person. That's a real good person. But she looks at Chidi and says, oh, that's a really good person who inspires me to want to be a better person. And I don't feel fake in relationship to Chidi. She feels more human and more realized because of her student-teacher relationship.
I think there's definitely an element of student-teacher in the Talmud that is a little bit about like living your life with your teacher, which I think is true for Eleanor and Chidi as well, of like, he is her literal teacher in that he stands at a blackboard and makes her read Plato and Aristotle and
Aristotle.
Yeah, like
Chipotle is supposed to be
Scorpiotes.
Yeah, but there is this element of like real Eleanor is a little bit like this sort of image
shiny
that
object.
is unattainable, as opposed to like, oh, if I just live with this person and they can both teach me things and I can walk with them, and that's really what a teacher is, right? And that's even the image that we're getting from this story, is that they're teacher and student walking or riding alongside each other on this ride of life.
I think it's so interesting you're describing this scene in the Talmud, that as long as I'm just associating here, it seems like as long as they're walking, even though the relationship is unsettled and Acher doesn't buy what Rebbe Meir is trying to tell him, they're in that conversation, and they're even Acher is even still trying to share, frame of reference and guide Rabbi Meir. But as soon as they walk into these settings, these social,
Mhm.
institutions, that it can't seem to fit in there. The good place is set up to be this neighborhood, like it is to some degree resembling, I guess. It's not. They do a lot of walking, so they'll either walk through the main
Uh,
street or they'll walk around or by the non-piranha infested lake or something like that. But it's also sufficiently not. It's not a city. It's not Arizona. It's not
Mhm.
Jacksonville. I wonder.
Cincinnati.
Yeah.
Everyone should.
Yeah.
A medium
Everyone-
city.
Yeah.
And as you're retelling this story from the Talmud, I'm just, aching at this sense of it's also so close. Why, when that friendship isn't powerful enough,
Mhm.
as I think, Myra, you were saying earlier, like what it's, there's so much that rides on having, and it's not even just the right friend. Rabbi Meir you couldn't ask for a better
Yeah.
person to try to welcome you back in that
Mhm.
situation.
Well, and that's also actually one of the interesting things I remember thinking about, because we learn from other places in the Talmud that Rebbe Meir also doesn't have like the greatest life
Right.
circumstances, right? The backstory for Acher, for Elisha ben Avuya, is right that he sees this child fulfilling a mitzvah for which you're supposed to be rewarded with a long life, and the child dies. That's sort of the backstory of his apostasy. And Rebbe Meir, his own children die, right? We get this story of the way his wife very delicately and smartly tells him about the fact that his two children have died, and yet Rabbi Meir never goes in that direction. He becomes more devout.
Mhm.
And I actually wonder, I've never thought about this before, but I wonder if maybe that's why he continues to seek Acher as his teacher,
Hmm.
as sort of someone who has felt this pain deeply and still, wanting, but not wanting to give it up, or not wanting to go that far, and figuring out, where is that line.
And to your point about like life circumstances, I wonder if the difference there is Ruria, like the
Mm.
way that Rabbi Meir's wife is in relationship with him regarding the death of his kids. What
In terms
happened
of the
to
support system that you
right,
have when these traumatic things
right,
happen to you, and whether or not you're able to overcome your life circumstances
right?
to
It's
continue to
it's who's
act
around you.
ethically and good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Who is around you, who's supporting you, who is inspiring you.
And there has to be some element that's just right, and then others can be approximate. I think in the previous episode, when it looks like Eleanor is going to be taken away on the train, and Tahani, says, in whatever way, I have some affection for her, for you, the way one might for a street
Stray
cat or
cat.
something.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And like, if that was the best that Eleanor had, that of course wouldn't be enough. But it's sort of, I guess it all revolves around Chidi, and to some degree around Michael. It takes a lot, I think, in the presence of all these people and the demons and everything, for her to stand up and say, all I can tell you is that I'm trying to be better, and this is why.
Mhm.
And knowing that, she can't be convinced that that's all going to work, and that, and that these people, right, she doesn't know for a fact that all these people are there for her, even her friends. And we see throughout the rest of the series how she has to win this trust. She has to convince herself to trust folks and to trust herself that she's up to it,
Mhm.
like over and over again. And maybe
Yeah.
Acher in the story in the Talmud is like, I can't, like, I'm willing to go to, what did you say, 13, like after the 12th study place, like,
Mhm.
fine, I'll go to one more, but like, how many can I go to and hear people and see the evidence that it's not going to work? I mean, it sounds like he gives it a shot. It just doesn't happen.
And that's one of the other tropes in the show, which I think is also a trope in the second half of this story, which Ben can get to. But the trope in the show is that, like, sometimes you do fail, and you have to sort of rely on your friends to pick you back up, or to help save you, or to come back for you. Yeah, I think that's also true in the end of the story in the Gemara.
Should I go for it?
Yeah.
Yes. The other reason I thought of this story, I really think about this when I think about the good place in general. I think a lot of times people say that Judaism doesn't have built up afterlife conversations, or we're so focused on the present. But really, the rabbis think rather intensely about Olam Haba and the world to come. My teacher, Candace Levy, says that the rabbis use Olam Haba as a way of solving a lot of the problems they can't quite make fit regarding the attributes of justice and mercy, and that Olam Haba is really where they work out a lot of their issues. And I think the Good Place really allows for a conversation about what are the ethics of the afterlife. It's not just how we expect us to behave in relationship to each other in human ethics, but how do we make our lives meaningful? How do our lives count in some capacity, our limited time, in a way that's at the end of our life, can we look back and keep learning? Is this it? Are we, as Sean says in a later episode, human beings when they die are just good or bad, full stop. So I love the second half of the story of talking about how does Acher actually, who says he doesn't belong in the world to come, how does he relate to it? When Acher passed away, the heavenly court declared that he should not be judged nor brought into the world to come. He should not be judged because he occupied himself with Torah, whose merit protects him, and he should not be brought into the world to come because he sinned. I love this, that like Acher goes to the medium place. Right?
That's great.
He learned too much Torah. Yeah.
If you tried to judge him, he would have too much Torah, in his toolbox that you would have to send him to the good place.
But he's also the arch sinner in the rabbinic pantheon, right? If we can't, what does it mean that Acher gets to go to the good place? That can't be right. So he's held in the medium place. I feel confident droshing that that's the medium place. He's not being judged. He's not in the world to come. So Rebbe Meir comes back into the story and he says, it is better that he be judged properly and brought into the world to come. So Rebbe Meir comes and says, this is bullshit. Why is my teacher stuck in the medium place? There's no chance of improving yourself. Rebbe Meir says, when I die, I will request this of heaven, and I will cause smoke to rise up from his grave as a sign that he is being sentenced in Gehenna. The idea that Rebbe Meir says, I actually do think Acher is redeemable. He does need to make penance for his sins in some capacity through some kind of afterlife learning process, which I think is what the Good Place ultimately gets to. In later seasons, when the characters realize that the ethics of the point system are also terrible and flawed, that what we really need in an afterlife ethic is one of continued learning and growth. So Rebbe Meir says, I think he should go through the system. He should go through the system and improve himself and learn. And so the Gemara says, when Rebbe Meir passed away, smoke rose up from the grave of Acher, implying that he got to leave the medium place like Mindy St. Clair and go through the system of I think Gehenna might be a little less pleasant than the system, but
well, a little more like the bad place, but
right.
So to some extent, he's being held accountable for the person he was on Earth,
right?
And that's sort of, you see this through the smoke that's rising from his grave. But then the rabbis aren't sort of pleased with that ending either, and do they want to speed up his process to get him to the world to come? And he has another, again, right, a friend who comes by and says, if we all stick together, there's no way they can keep him, paying for his sins, and they'll have to let him come to the world to come.
Yeah.
And that's the end of the story with Rebbe Yochanan.
Yeah, the end of Rebbe Yochanan says, really, that was so nice that Rebbe Meir just sentenced his teacher to be burned. When I die, the smoke is going to be extinguished from his grave. You really liked that line of the Rabbi Yochanan saying, can it be that there was one sage among us who left the path and we cannot save him? If we hold him by the hand, who will remove him from our protection? That Rabbi Yochanan says, we can help facilitate Acher's tshuva process. We are the people who can bring him along. And I think
if we go and we hold his hand and we walk with him, and if we all sort of come together as a group, and we see that throughout the Good Place, I think also of like, they have to judge us as a group. That later seasons when they're in front of the judge, like maybe she'll judge us as a group, that we improve as a group, and we all of that. And this idea of like, in order to sort of become that best version of myself, to go to Olam Haba, I need the help of friends who will hold my hand.
And I think that's like the ethics of the Olam Haba system that I really appreciate that the Good Place has to offer, which is that your life means something. Your life becomes the text. Your life becomes the Torah that you study in the next life, that you're able to fully see the consequences of your actions how did my life impact other people? How were some of my character flaws contextual, and how are some of them things that, you know what, I chose not to work on, and I'm really sorry about that. And so I love this story. The story ends with Rabbi Yochanan. When Rabbi Yochanan passes away, the smoke ceased to rise up from the grave of Acher. The idea that even Acher, even this figure who is literally called other in the rabbinic tradition, isn't beyond saving.
I had started to have a stomach ache at the very end of this, a cheaty stomach ache, because my understanding is that Acher, like what I mean, on the one hand, he goes off the path of the Jewish path. He begins to reject the basic ideas, but that the other thing he's done is to collaborate with the Romans to persecute the Jews and his fellow sages, or his earlier fellow sages, and which to me seems like the worst thing. And I liked where you were going, Myra, at saying maybe as a group. So if the rabbis are a collective who, okay, they've got one guy who really, did some pretty serious damage, but if you look at all of us in our project, like there's no project that's going to be without its serious bad side effect. And but take us all together, because he was part of that, and part of what made us good, is him. Like that I could see in terms of the group process. I have to think about stomaching Acher as somehow being cleansed of his, like the only thing I could say maybe, and I don't know the characters of the timeline enough to know based on which, but you could illuminate if you want, is maybe enough time has passed that the damage he's done has healed. So at least, somebody can in some sense forgive him enough to say, well, bad is what you left behind. It turned out okay, I don't know if that's how it goes.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that there is something, even though this isn't the point system, it's a different ethical system, and that there's still something a little distasteful about that process. I'm thinking, I'll adapt Winston Churchill's democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. That really, tshuva is not a satisfying solution. The idea of God's overwhelming mercy, even almost to the extent there in first chapter of Brachot, the idea of God's mercy and God's justice being set apart from each other, and recognizing that God is overall merciful, but has to let justice flash through the world in order to prevent the effects of too much mercy. But the alternative of too much justice, we have midrashim of the world just can't stand in the face of perfect justice. So that tshuva is never satisfying, because something's still gone wrong, but it's better. I think it's better than all the other forms of alternative ethical sorting out of the meaning of our lives.
So where I think in the show, Eleanor, we've talked around some previous episodes about just how bad is Eleanor when she's bad. I mean, this kind of movie theater ticket behavior is certainly not delightful. But the other part, which we see in this episode, where the company we now know, where she defrauds people by selling these supplements that don't work and probably are harmful, and is gleeful about it. Like that's, like, I don't think she's, killed anybody. Even the dog from a few episodes ago, who she let eat all the treats, like, is suffering, but,
right.
Still
or the things she does with her roommate's dress and the t-shirt, which Trevor is wearing in this episode, right? Is wearing the t-shirt.
Right. But see, it's also weird that like I laughed at that, right? Like she mistreated a dog. Like the line that they have to thread to make Eleanor a character that you want to root for, but also you need to understand that she ended up you have to feel okay about her ending up in the bad place. If she was an amazing character, you would be upset about the injustice of this from the beginning of season 1.
Well, my reframe is that it's not like, from her point of view, like I could accept that a person could change. There's all kinds of that, and I'm a total believer in that tshuva process, in definitely in the center of the bell curve or whatever, then fairly far out. And Eleanor is we don't see anybody who's been poisoned by her bad by the stuff that she's selling on the phone, so we don't know whether that actually happened. If we did, like, we would feel like that would be a line that would cross. That's the only little bit of my stomach ache around some of these things. And and Acher is tough, because I definitely the ideological part of Acher, questioning and being a total radical questioner around this is like that. I think is certainly redeemable. Like that's not, to me, that doesn't throw him out. Actually, it's a good way to bring back the episode. We haven't even talked about Groucho Marx, which has been, I believe, quoted in different ways. I refuse to join any club that would have me as a member. Like, I don't know if there's Achers, like, you can, you're not the ones, like there's a club maybe I'd like to belong to, but it's not this one. Like you guys still believe you still believe these things that I can't fundamentally believe in, even if you're willing to reintegrate me.
And like the rabbis here being concerned about like the integrity of Olam Haba. What is it really? This guy gets to come in. What's the other story?
Right.
It's
after his death that there is like one member of like, aside from his own student, there's one member of the rabbinic class who sort of takes pity on him, but it's after his death. I think there is this sense of, would people, not to explain away certain behaviors, but I really like when people ask me why I became a rabbi, or, you know, what's important about that, like the thing that I talk about always is helping people find a sense of belonging. And that, you know, for me, Jewish community provided that place of belonging, and that without that, people can really fall into a sense of deep loneliness and despair, and even at its taking that as far as it can go, a real sense of anger or depression that ultimately can find unhealthy outlets that undermine our understanding of what is a just and right world, right? Like, you know, when we hear of people who have committed mass shootings or other atrocities like that, like how often do we find that those people were shunned by parts of society, or were desperately lonely? Not that it explains away in any way the behavior that they've done, but it does, I think, trigger something in me that says, what is our responsibility to continually reach out to people who don't feel that sense of belonging, who don't feel that they have relationship with the world and people, the world, and a sense of rootedness in a life that can be very destabilizing often. When I see this story and when I see The Good Place, I think that's one of the things that really speaks to me, and I think really comes out in this episode of how much does a sense of belonging and people's willingness to continually sort of like fight their way into your life, right? Like the people in The Good Place in this episode are fighting their way in. And as we've said already, like she doesn't always accept it at the beginning. It really takes her a long time to say, okay, fine, I do want to be part of this group. I you know, she rejects them along the way quite a bit. The willingness to be persistent in pursuing someone and wanting to invite them in continually, and to see beyond what they present to you in terms of their potential. That's the mitzvah that we're commanded to here.
And even on Earth, the company that where she had been temping for so long, that was willing to have her and wanted to, like they were, and continuing to have people like that go back for her even after she either can't or doesn't, you know, accept that. That's, I guess, something which is being shown to us too. It wasn't just this Good Place people who were in her life story.
What's the response? The response there is not like, okay, well, I guess you can continue to be a temp and think about it, or like, oh, let's continue this conversation. The response is, well, then we have to let you go. If you don't want to be part of us, then we're rejecting you. And like that is familiar to her. Yeah. Right. But like people continuing to pursue her after she says, I'm not so sure about being part of your group. That's the thing that's unfamiliar to her.
And it's going to be this great nudge, you know, when we get into the future iterations where it starts to happen on Earth, which is so cool.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, thank you. This is actually was a great text to bring to this, and it'll be in the notes, and I encourage people to both read it, but it's almost requires you to take it and have a conversation with somebody about it, because there's so much to unpack in addition to what we've done. You have teachers who help to launch you on thinking about ethics or even just ethical behavior that you want to call out.
I will say that definitely want to give a big shout out to my teacher, Rabbi Elliot Dorff. I think a Gadol Hador, a great teacher of our generation, of our days. He is, I think, in the world of ethics, his expertise is in medical ethics and bioethics. And I certainly took courses with him on that in rabbinical school, but also just in general, an example of a person who I think not only studies ethics as an academic and as a rabbi, but studies ethics in the sense of really being willing to live a life where you're open to changing your mind when you read things as society grows and develops and changes in front of you. So yeah, Rabbi Elliot Dorff is certainly my teacher in ethics and in life.
Two I was thinking of, Rabbi Richard Levy, Zichrono Livracha, who was an amazing teacher of mine at HUCLA, and really embodied one's life being a text and using your teacher as an example. I really get from him. A bunch of us went to him and said, "Hey, we really want to learn something with you," and he said, "Sure, we're going to learn Rambam's Hilchot Deot of." As far as translated that as like human dispositions or whatever. And he's very much somebody, as we're reading this text, of it's somebody who's very much embodying this intentionally lived life. And then my teacher, Rabbi Rachel Adler, who really made me think about ethics are being the core, the be all and end all of the tradition, and that without having a ethical core or a concern with how we're treating other people being what the Torah inspires you to continually improve at, we're really futzing around the edges without continually returning to that.
Well, thank you, Ben and Myra, for doing this together, for co-hosting today. I hope we will do this again more than once.
That'd be great.
Sounds good. Thanks for having us.
Well, thank you out there for listening to another episode of Tove. If you've made it this far, we hope we've added something to your day. Help other people find the podcast by subscribing, rating us, sharing on your social media. Our episodes' texts are worth a look and a deeper dive, which you can find at tovegoodplace.com. I'm John Spirasavet, and you can follow me at RabbiJS3 on Twitter or Instagram, or drop a note to tove@tovegoodplace.com. It was great co-hosting this episode with Ben Gurin and Myra Meskin. You can follow some of Myra's work on Instagram and Facebook at Brandeis Collegiate Institute. Thanks again for listening, and in the spirit of the official Good Place podcast, now go learn more about something good.
Bum, 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 bum.